Okay. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. A'udhu billahi minash shaitan rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Wa salatu wa salamu ala sayyidina Rasulullah wa alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Thank you everyone for joining us today for this important workshop and session as part of our continuing educational series on social justice and racism. I'm really delighted to mention that we have a really august panel gathered here today to discuss this important topic of systemic racism, challenges, and remedies. So let me outline the format of the program today. Each of our three speakers, who I'll introduce shortly, will speak for 15 minutes each on the topic, and then we'll have 15 to 30 minutes at the end for a Q&A session. So we should have plenty of time for when the program finishes and the ability for all of you to pray the Maghrib prayer, inshallah. And also, if you have questions during the program, please use the chat facility to type your questions. So with that, let me start the program. And I'll start by saying a few words as a Muslim from my perspective on what's going on in America and indeed the world today. So 1400 years ago, a black Abyssinian slave was barely able to utter the words, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe," as a large, heavy boulder was placed on his chest, nearly crushing him. This was Bilal ibn Rabah radiallahu anh, who went on to become one of the most trusted and loyal companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He was being punished for rebelling against his masters from the tribe of the Quraysh, the elitist, oppressive system of that time. He had joined a new group called the Muslims, demanding equality and justice for all. Those words, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe," still haunt us to this day, as we bear witness to the cruelty of racism against our black brothers and sisters, and see the lives that have unnecessarily ended early. The lives of George Floyd, Rayshard Brooks, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and the list, unfortunately, goes on and on and on. I want to remind all of us, starting with myself first, that Islam is against all forms of racism and bigotry on the basis of both revelation and reason. And in fact, racism did exist during the pre-Islamic time or the period of Jahiliyyah. And Islam came as a form of divine social justice, making clear to us that all people are born equal in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the only characteristic that makes one person superior to another is his or her levelty of piety, not the color of our skin. And in fact, ethnic diversity is part of the divine plan and a means of enrichment for humankind. In Surah Ar-Rum, verse 30, ayah 22, Allah Azza wa Jal says, "Among his signs is the creation of the heaven for people of knowledge." And the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in his farewell sermon, spoke out firmly against racism. "O people, your Lord is one, and your father Adam is one. There is no favor of an Arab over a foreigner, nor a foreigner over an Arab, and neither white skin over black skin, nor black skin over white skin, except by righteousness. Have I not delivered the message?" So I think it's really important for us to reflect on the lessons that we have from our religion. And it's really important for us to understand that an attack on one minority community is an attack on all minority communities. And in the words of the late great Dr. King, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. I would also argue that it is the same forces of jahliya or ignorance that are driving the insidious evil of racism today. We are at a pivotal moment, a moment that matters. And as Muslims living in America, we must meet the moment and support our brothers and sisters in the African American community. I now have the privilege of introducing our panel, and I'm very privileged to be able to do this. So we have New York State Senator Kevin Parker. Senator Parker represents the 21st District in the New York State Senate. The 21st District consists of many diverse communities, including Flatbush, East Flatbush, Midwood, Ditmas Park, Kensington, Windsor Terrace, and Park Slope. Senator Parker also serves as the Majority Whip and Chair of the Energy and Telecommunications Committee of the New York State Senate. We also have one of our community members and a practicing attorney, Brother Omar Mohammedi, Esquire, who's a managing partner of OTMLAW and is involved with Amal, also a professor of law at Fordham Law School. He's also the president and founder of the Association of Muslim American Lawyers, Amal, I just referred to. He's also a member of the advisory board of trustee Teaneck Center for Religious Understanding and a committee member of the Citizen Union for Civic Engagement. Brother Omar is a former NYC Commissioner on Human Rights, and in fact, he was appointed by Mayor Michael Bloomberg to become the first Muslim and Arab New York City Commissioner on Human Rights from October 2002 to December 2014. And last, and importantly, we have our brother Mayor Mohammed Hameeduddin, who's the mayor of Teaneck, New Jersey. He's an American politician and the mayor of Teaneck, New Jersey, as I mentioned. He's the first Muslim American to be elected mayor in Bergen County and one of a few Muslims in the entire country to hold the office of mayor. He also is a very experienced community activist. So that's the introduction of our panel. And now let me introduce New York Senator Kevin Parker. Senator Parker, if you could address the issue of systemic racism, the challenges and the opportunities. Please, Senator Parker.
Absolutely, and thank you very much for that generous introduction. And let me just say salam alaikum to everybody who's paying attention and listening to the call. Yeah, there's really so much to talk about. I almost don't know where to start. The first thing I do want to do is talk about what racism actually is and start kind of beginning with a definition, if we may. When we talk about racism, we are talking about prejudice based on primarily biological traits. The skin color is just one of the traits that people go by. It also can be because of physical features, but also racism can be defined as nationality, right? It can be defined, sometimes with language, right? Like for instance, when we talk about somebody being Latino or Latina, right? That's really defining race as language, right? Because really being Latino or Latina is really just predicated on what language you speak. And so I really kind of go by scholars like Neely Fuller and Dr. Francis Cross Welsing when we talk about racism as being prejudice plus power. And so one of the things that I don't want people to fall into the trap of doing in their conversations is saying, well, everybody's racist. Everybody, yeah, you can discriminate, but racism is really about power. And it's really and because of that, there's only really one functional type of racism in the world, and that's white supremacy. And so I typically don't use the word racism. I talk about white supremacy because that's really what we need to deal with, right? And the other thing too is I think that is particularly apropos for me to be addressing a Muslim group, in part because 50% of the Muslim population in the United States, and probably larger than that in New York, despite the fact that New York has the largest Muslim population in the country, is African American, right? And so when we talk about people being Muslims, right? We also see then race as religion, right? So it could be race as biological features, it could be race as language, it could be race as religion as well. And certainly over the last few decades, we've seen our fair share, more than our fair share, frankly, of anti-Islamic phobia and racism and white supremacy towards Muslims because of their religion. So much so that we've had attacks on people like Sikhs who have been perceived as being Muslim and have been attacked in this context. And so that when we talk about this work, the important thing is to kind of understand that it's prejudice plus power, and that prejudice can be against you. It's not just I want people to understand it's not just a Black dynamic, right? In fact, racism, which is, to a large degree, a very American dynamic, really, as we understand the modern antecedents of what we see in terms of white supremacy, comes from, white colonists and their need to create a social and political justification for the economic exploitation of enslaved Africans that they have brought over, right? And simultaneously declaring their freedom, right? And they were dealing with a hypocrisy of declaring their freedom while simultaneously enslaving a whole group of people. And so they developed, the first antecedents of white supremacy in the way that we understand it today are born in those moments in order to create both scientific, social, and political justifications for their subjugation of other human beings. And so racism becomes prejudice plus power. But then also there's levels to racism, right? Racism is a hierarchy, right? So that's the second thing to understand is a hierarchy, where Blacks are on the bottom, and other people you can argue about who's next, but it's clear that people of African descent are on the bottom of that hierarchy, right? And I'm going to take some privilege and the expression my father used to say, there's nothing in America, there's nothing worse than being a nigger, right? And so that's really kind of like the defining way that I think about the idea of a hierarchy in the context of racism and kind of where people land on that spectrum, right? And the worst thing is when they really want to insult you, right? Like, so one of the things I've heard, I say this a lot during the Iraq War, as they refer to people who were Arabs as sand niggers, right? And so again, there's nothing worse than that. But that's essentially saying that in that context, you were on the lowest rung of this racial spectrum in which Africans, people of African descent, Blacks, occupy that lowest position. Third, then there's the notion that the way that we engage in white supremacy, in this country and around the world, is not one dimensional, and this is the part that people get confused about, right? And it's probably various dimensions, but I'm gonna keep it real simple in the context of this conversation, which is that there's individual racism and there's systemic or institutional racism, right? So there's individual racism, and then there's institutional racism, and they're not separated from each other, right? They're two sides of the same coin, right? And so when you see what the death and the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota, you see a cop individually kill him, but the notion but he's supported by institution, right? So there's individual action, right, and there's individual racism, but there's also supported by an institution, right? To see it more broadly is that when somebody calls you a racial epithet or calls you a name, right, that's individual racism, right? When an institution, right, like a bank doesn't give you a loan, right, or tell you I will only give you a loan for this amount, or you can only get a loan if you live in this community, right, then that becomes institutional racism. It's not really about the individual, right? When the policies and procedures are moving against you to support white supremacy, right? Like we saw in Levittown with the development of Long Island, right? As a public policy person, I think about that all the time. You know, that's institutional racism, right? And so what we see now in this moment with the protesters and protests and uprisings that we're seeing across the nation is people standing up and saying they're no longer going to stand for both the individual acts and the institutional acts of white supremacy that permeate our community, and particularly as it plays out within the context of police and how police and police departments and police activities, you know, essentially create a militarization of white supremacy, right? So the day-to-day militarization of white supremacy is played out by your local police, right? When they pull you over, when they harass you, you know, when they shoot you down or choke you out until you can't breathe, right? Literally. And so, you know, I wanted really people to kind of understand those breakdowns. And I think I've personally experienced all of those things as an African-American man my whole life, right? And so everything from, you know, I grew up in the Bushwick Projects. I lived there until I was about 9 years old in 1976. We moved to the community I live in now, which is Flatbush, right near what we call the Junction, down the block from Brooklyn College. When I moved here 40 something years ago, right, it was an all-white community. We were the second Black family on the block. I was going to PS 183 about 2 miles away. I used to walk to school every day. I literally used to get chased by a group of white kids who used to call me nigga and throw stuff at me and try to assault me. And, you know, that was literally my daily routine for a number of months. You know, but then also have dealt with it, you know, obviously in the same way that many other people have dealt with it in terms of, you know, not being able to get a loan, not be able to, you know, hard time getting a house in the community that you want to get, you know, buy property. To see people now come into this community and be able to get money to do things that they would not allow Black people in this community to do, right? That's the institutional thing that I've seen when you, and that's one of the things that why gentrification, for instance, is so maddening for African Americans. It's not just the losing of your community, but when you had a vision for your community and you needed financing to do it, and you played the game and played by the rules and you know, try to kind of better yourself and better your community, you weren't allowed to. And then as soon as white people come and start displacing you, they're given all the capital, all the opportunity, you know, to get things and have a better life that you've been denied. And so, you know, it's a really, it's a difficult dynamic that many of us have lived. And like I said, I think it's particularly bad for African Americans, but it's not unique and it's not restricted for African Americans. You see all types of groups, African Americans, Latinos, Asians, Muslims. You know, the ugly twin sister of racism is you know, misogyny, right? And what we see happening to women, right? And so we see this kind of oppression, and I think they're all related to each other. And so if we talk about how do we resolve this, we could be here all day with just, you know, any one of the topics, right? Like, how do we divide it? How do we deal with this in education? How do we deal with it in healthcare? How do we deal with it in housing? How do we deal with it in the context of police reforms or some of the other things that we're dealing with? And certainly, you know, let me just say, to keep it on police reform, because that's a lot of what we're talking about nowadays, that there's a number of things that we've done in the state legislature. We actually passed 10 bills last week to address some of the issues and the clamors of the protesters. Just to be real clear, of the 10 bills, 4 of them were mine. And these are bills that I didn't write 2 weeks ago or last week. Many of these bills have been in for 10 years. And in fact, a few of the bills that passed actually got written not because they were addressing the issues of African Americans. They were actually addressing the issues of Muslims. We actually wrote, one of the bills we actually wrote was a bill, at the time we called it a special independent inspector general for law enforcement intelligence, right? And that was really to deal with the issue of the New York City Police Department using their intelligence department to unlawfully monitor Muslim activities. And they were doing it at the time, like 10 years ago. This was happening actually in Jersey, which is interesting. But the NYPD were surveilling Muslims in Jersey, right? And we realized that we had really lost control of the intelligence apparatus in the state of New York, and no one knew what was going on. And we wanted to kind of develop some oversight and transparency for that process. I have a bill that deals with false 911 claims. There's another one that provides that creates a body cam program for state police. There's one for New York City now, but there has not been one for state police now. We have one for state police. And then the fourth bill that I have is the right to record, which would essentially keep cops from doing what they've been doing since the George Floyd murder, which is knocking phones and cameras out of people's hands so they can't record their unlawful activities. We did a number of other bills that were really important. One is the Eric Garner anti-chokehold bill, which essentially would make what Officer Panelists did in terms of murdering Eric Garner in Staten Island 6 years ago illegal, not just against the regulations, but it actually is connected to a criminal penalty. We also have done a bill on what we call 50A here in the state of New York, which allows a grand jury to get access to the personnel records of police officers to understand their bad acts and add them to the discussion. And then a special prosecutor bill, which essentially breaks up the incestuous relationships between the police department and the county DAs, such that the attorney general, who doesn't deal with the county DAs in the same way, doesn't deal with with police officers, local police officers in the same way, and then not as relying upon them to build cases, now can act as a special prosecutor, especially in cases in which a police officer murders an unarmed civilian. That bill I think is really, really important and provides the kind of check that we need. There's also something called the Stat Act, which is important, which makes courts provide statistics on police officers and local police officers and how they're operating, and a bill that affirms the right for a person in custody to receive physical and mental health help while they're in custody. And lastly, a bill that requires a police officer who fires their weapon to report that firing of their weapon, whether they're on duty or off duty, within 6 hours of the firing of their weapon. Again, accountability, transparency, but there's still so much more to do. I have another bill on that really defines and provides some penalty around excessive use of force. And then another bill I'm calling if you see something, say something, which requires a police officer, if they're with other officers and they witness a police officer, another police officer, committing a crime against a civilian, that they have to do something, that they're compelled to engage without penalty to them. The thing I'm most actually excited about is a bill I'm calling the fourth response, and I'll wrap up with this, which is that in the context of our 911 system, we have three basic responses: a fire emergency response, a health emergency response, and then a police criminal justice response. That police criminal justice response is the default response, unfortunately. So if you have somebody who's having a mental health issue, then we send the police, right? And then unfortunately, most of them don't have good mental health training, and so their training kicks in, and so when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and we get people who are broken, bruised, arrested, and oftentimes killed. This explains why Rikers Island has the largest mental health facility in the entire country, because we're spending a lot of time criminalizing people who are mentally ill, which I think is the wrong way to approach it. And so my bill would actually create a fourth response in which, in the cases in which you had somebody who was having a mental health crisis, you would call them, and instead of the police showing up, you would actually have, mental health professionals showing up. Just like if you had a heart attack, you don't call the fire department, right? You call the EMS, because you want somebody who comes there with medical training to deal with a medical problem. In this particular case, I believe that a mental health crisis is deserving of a mental health response. And I think that becomes the beginning of dealing with the systematic issues around white supremacy. I think that we can't legislate people's attitudes. And so I really don't spend a lot of time thinking through individual cases of racism. And I think that we shouldn't be, talking about every case like it's an individual case, right? And dealing with it like it's just a matter of people getting to know each other. It's prejudice plus power. People understand what they're doing. White supremacy is not a function of people not being familiar with each other. White supremacy is a power dynamic. And we really must understand that it is a power dynamic, deal with that power dynamic, and change the structures in our city, states, and federal government such that it doesn't continue to acquiesce and to cater to white supremacy. And so I'm looking forward to this conversation and the input of the folks on this illustrious panel. Thank you again for including me. And I look forward to us, working on this issue as we go forward. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Senator Parker. Don't go away. We're going to have you for the Q&A session. We've got quite a few questions for you, but appreciate you clarifying and redefining and providing context around the definition of racism. And of course, we're all very thankful for the work you're doing on the New York State Legislature. So please stay around. We'll have some questions for you as well. Let me now turn the program over to our second speaker, Brother Omar Mohammedi. And Brother Omar, perhaps getting the attorney's perspective on this issue of systemic racism, and also an area of expertise that you work in is the area of social justice. So let me turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Maliki yawmiddin. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. Ihdina as-sirata al-mustaqim. Sirata alladhina an'amta alayhim ghayril maghdubi alayhim waladdallin. I'm sure that everyone here is driving while black. And everyone hears, lately specifically, flying while Muslim. And everyone hears that what law enforcement says mostly, which I'm going to address most this issue from a law enforcement perspective, because there is different form of racism. And I'm going to address it from a civil rights perspective as well as a law enforcement. And you hear all this, and that's what they call institutional racism. Institutional racism is when an institution established this pattern, repeated actions by law enforcement in trying to enforce the law, but at the same time, profiling people based on their race, based on national origin, based on our religion. And that's the type of profiling that usually calls for institutional racism that has impacted minorities, specifically African Americans, Hispanic as well. And you heard, I do believe that you heard Hispanic means drugs, African American means rapist or involved in murder, Muslims involved in terrorism. And we see that. And those are pretexts that law enforcement usually use for the purpose of committing violence against citizens during stop or arrest, or during interaction with any citizen in different formats, such as going to board an airplane, or any other form. And those type of racism, institutional racism, that is really has created a lot of issues for many minorities that we have to make sure that we fight. I give you an example as a lawyer representing many people, as far as police brutality, as far as arresting people because they were flying, they were imams, and they seem 6 people on the airplane. They look religious enough for them to be arrested. I have seen many other forms of profiling, someone driving and being an African American, beaten up and taken to custody just because he was asking the question, why am I stopped? We have seen many of those. And the most egregious case that I have handled, that I have seen, the Diallo case, and that's in the 90s. And during that time, you can see the institution of racism that was installed in the NYPD during Giuliani era, where he had 3,000 street crime unit in plainclothes going to the Bronx and patrolling the area where they stop people under the stop and frisk. And Amadou Diallo was one of the people, innocent people, came from work, 19 years old, walking to go to his apartment, and the police asked him to stop. He took his wallet and he showed it to them. They shoot him 41 times, 41 times. And when people were asking, what did you do that to the police officer? When we asked them in depositions, because we thought he was a rapist. That stigma of African-American being a racist, being a rapist, is clearly in the mind of police officers. Why? Because of this institution of racism, because of the police departments training those police officers in a way that they do not really understand, or even if they do understand, they think they have a right to do it because they have the weapon and they have the power. And that's exactly what Senator Parker said. So this type of institution of racism that has impacted our community. And during that time, there were many protests, and it was there. And I see a lot of African-American Muslims going out there and participating. That time, I didn't see a lot of Muslims other than African-American. And I kept saying to the Muslim community, you need to participate because one day you will be also, and you have to participate because of the principle that we stand for under the Constitution. And you need to participate. And obviously, that also have impacted the Muslim community after 9/11, right? And during the time that the stop and frisk, the Attorney General office issued a report as a result of our filing of the lawsuit, and because of what's happened with the 4 officers killing an innocent man 41 times. And during that time, there was a report that was issued, and this is what the report shows. The pattern of discriminatory practice against minorities, and particularly Black and stop and frisk, demonstrate that minorities are stopped at a higher rate than whites. Black men comprise of 25.6% of the city population, yet 50%, over 50% of all stops were Blacks. This report reveals that Black comprise 62.7% of all stops made by New York Police Department Street Crime Unit. In addition, Black are stopped 2.1 times more than other whites on suspicion of committing a violent crime. 2.4 times more than a white on suspicion of carrying a weapon. That tells you. As far as after that report, the street crime unit was disbanded, but that was not enough because many incidents happened afterwards. And the reason why many incidents happened afterwards, because we are not taking this seriously, and we have to. We all came here dressed up because we are in COVID-19 sitting at home, but we thought how important it is for us because of the subject matter. I'm asking all of us, including myself, to take this matter seriously and participate with our brothers and sisters, African Americans, trying to make sure to help and unite against racism. That is actually our duty as Muslims to have, because justice is an important aspect of Islamic faith, and we have to do that. And the other reason why we need to do this, because as Muslims, we also face racism, the surveillance that Senator Parker was mentioning of the NYPD against the Muslim community, and us having to fight with the NYPD regarding this matter, where you have the institutional racism again, when you have someone, like you have an institution bringing people to study Muslims Americans. how we can watch them. Why and who? What are the characteristics of watching them? Washing them themselves 5 times a day. What does it mean? Wudu, right? Based on religion. Race is based on religion, just the way based on race. And when you have some like NYPD, an institution of racism, where they will show, for instance, a video called The Third Jihad to train police officers about these matters when they go and stop African Americans or Muslims, and they have their principle that already established that these people are bad people from the beginning. And that is the problem. One day I went and I gave a lecture and a training to the NYPD officers, and I was going around precincts asking me to give them training on that, on the sensitivity of the Muslim community in general. And I was explaining a case that they handled. There were 4 Pakistanis wearing the religious clothes, going to a wedding, going through George Washington Bridge, driving. And when they were driving, they stopped by police. They were arrested. They were all doctors. And during that time, Commissioner Kelly, I called him and I asked him what is happening. He said, this is an isolated incident. I said, I'm sorry, this is not an isolated incident. This is an institution of racism that you have to take care of. And when I was giving that training program, one officer stood up and I was explaining this case. And he said, what do you expect us to do? These people killed us. I said to him, you are a disgrace. The badge you're carrying is a disgrace. It's a disgrace that you say something like that you are a police officer. Why? Because it is the training that is the problem. The institution of race has to stop. Same thing with African American, same thing with Hispanic, same thing with everyone else. And I will mention something else. When the surveillance against the Muslim community happened, the NYPD did not stop surveilling the community, but they went to court and they asked, we can surveil you, but we're not going to allow the court we're doing. That's actually Senator Parker, you know, you're here, I'm telling you this, and you know it. The legislator is very clear about this. That we need to take care of that as well. We cannot allow any law enforcement to be secret about their actions. We need transparency. The other thing that I'd like to mention, what we need this qualified immunity. Qualified immunity that has caused a lot of issues for people to sue police officer acting under color of state law. In 1871, Congress passed a bill to secure rights of the nation and civil rights of people in the post-Civil War South era. We all know what's happened there. In that bill, a section came out of that. It called Section 83, Title 42, which provides a cause of action for individuals to file lawsuit against state or local officials who violate their rights under the Constitution. From 1871 until 1960, the government and the police officers or any law enforcement at the federal level as well, could not claim qualified immunity. It was not until 1967, the Supreme Court, in one of the cases, suddenly found that government actor had a good faith defense for making arrests under constitutional status based on a common law defense that has been used for the tort of false arrest, a good faith. That has to go. I think, and I believe that there are initiatives on this. If this was not used before, should not be used now. And as an attorney, I have found that to be very difficult to filing a lawsuit against individuals who are law enforcement officers because they claim that immunity. By the way, during the time that I was representing the 6 Imams case, flying while Muslim, same thing, right? Congress passed a resolution at that time against my own clients, trying to find a way not to provide any protected rights under the Constitution because you are flying. Therefore, Peter King, who you know, all of you from New York, stated that this exception has to apply to these people and people flying. I believe in the justice system, and I think the justice system said you cannot do that. Then we cannot do that for this one as well. We cannot allow police officers or any law enforcement officer to kill and arrest with impunity and get acquitted. Also, what I like to happen? I like to happen that hate crimes will be instituted and be stronger against even law enforcement. Because when you kill someone with intention because of race or because of religion or because of anything else other than the crime itself, there should be hate crime. It should be hate crime. I'm asking our Muslim community, I'm asking the Falah Center, I'm asking members of our community, I'm asking all communities to unite, face this institution of racism from all perspectives, from a law enforcement perspective and any other perspective. And I'm hoping that we can work together and please be active. Please do whatever it needs. Specifically when it comes to the Falah Center, we were victim of institution of racism in a different form, where the township instituted this racism against us, where they changed the law against us because we want to establish a masjid, a religious institution. That is another form of racism. And we need all to stand up against that type of racism. This country is better than that. The Constitution is better than that. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. Jazakallah khair, Brother Omar, for providing the attorney perspective. I'll ask you the same thing as Senator Parker. Please don't go away, because I think we're going to have a few questions in the Q&A section also.
Sure.
So now I'm going to turn it to our brother Hameeduddin from Teaneck, New Jersey, to give his view, where he has the local politician view, I suppose, on the topic of systemic racism and how do we address this. So, Assalamu alaikum, Brother Hameeduddin, and please, I'm turning the program over to you.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you, Nadeem. It is very appropriate that Falah Center put this program together. Allah, fought for their right to exist by taking the township of Bridgewater to court when they denied you to have your masjid in Bridgewater. So I'm very happy that you are taking on this mantle to talk about systemic racism that is affecting the African-American community in America right now. I think it's also my honor to be on this program with Omar Mohammedi, who is someone that who, he was in the social justice movement before it was cool, I'd like to say. Being and taking on the NYPD is not for the faint of heart. Taking on the U.S. justice system is not for the faint of heart. And he sacrificed so much for America as well as the Muslim community that I thank him for that. Senator Parker, who I had the privilege of being on a panel with a few years ago, because one of his staffers, Omar Khan, who now works for the New York State Attorney's Office, used to work for him and put us on a panel together. And I'd just like to talk, he's been an advocate for social justice for everybody for a long time. So it's very appropriate that we not only stand with him at this time, but we make sure that we get him to higher office so that he can advocate for justice not only for the Muslim community, but for all Americans. Paying it forward is something that all politicians and people who are in power should do. And Senator Parker is one of those individuals who always likes to pay it forward and always likes to mentor people and put them into positions of power. So thank you for that, Senator. I bring a unique perspective to what's going on in this country. Teaneck, New Jersey has always had a large African-American population. So it's basically 35% African-American, 40% Caucasian, white, and then the rest is other. And we were the first school system in New Jersey to voluntarily integrate the schools. Now, this is something that is a good achievement, but it also is not the only thing that liberal white America likes to talk about in Teaneck, because it doesn't mean that our problems went away just because people gave African Americans their rights to be in the same schools as whites and not be segregated. So in 1990, when I was in high school, we actually had a shooting in our town where an African American named Philip Pinnell was shot in a playground because there was reports that he had a gun and a gun was found on him. And this opened up a lot of fissures in our town of not only policing, but racism, re-examination of what it meant of Teaneck as this melting pot, and was it really a place of where everybody lived in harmony? And I think that we had a lot of, just like what you see today, it depends on who's in power and who's telling the story. So if you're in power and you tell the story of we voluntarily integrated the schools, then all of a sudden you're like, you're saying, oh, you should be happy because look at what we did for you. And that is not equality. That is not equity, right? Nobody gives you your rights. They're my rights, right? And I think that this form of racism in terms of how people are dealing with people of color, specifically the African-American community, and I want to hold on point on this, because we live in a time, if a shooting happens in a synagogue, the next day the police are at the synagogue. After the New Zealand shooting at the mosque, the police are at the mosque to protect us the next day. For our African-American community, and I understand that I don't understand what it means to be African-American, but still I will have to stand with the African-American community, is to understand that who are they going to call when it's the police who are the ones who are making them and doing the crimes against the community? And this is a very, very, a subject that nobody ever wanted to address. Nobody ever wanted to believe it until the invention of the iPhone. Until we started seeing things recorded with our own eyes, 8 minutes of a man who wouldn't take his neck off a man's, take his knee off a man's neck and literally kill them in front of the camera. And if this is happening, the African-American community has been telling this has been happening to us for years, and still no police reforms. You can talk about Eric Garner, that was a few years ago. You talk about Trayvon Martin, you talk about everything that's happened over the last, since 2012. And this is the first time now that you're finally saying enough is enough. So I say this because I went through this in 1990 as a high school student, and my town went through this. And some of the reforms that came out of it were interesting. So now our police department is 40% minority. It reflects that in the supervisors also. So we also have a chain of command that we actually promote people, and hopefully that the diversity of our ranks will be the same as the diversity in our town. And we make a conscious effort to do that. And that's been going on for 20 years. We also have not fired a shot in the last 30 years. No one, thank God, has fired a shot in our town in the last 30 years. And I've given you another example of how training can stop this. Last summer, we had a distressed individual commit suicide in my town. There was 3 police officers who were trying to talk to him while he was in the car. They knew that he was in distress, and he ended up shooting himself. Now, the police officers didn't fire one shot. They didn't light up, there wasn't, unloading of magazines into the car because they heard a shot, and there wasn't an unloading, even though there was a police officer right there in harm's way. And a lot of this can be done with training, right? I'm not talking about like making cops to be out like Jack Bauer, and saying that, they're going to shoot him in the shoulder and the legs and the knee, which is, any cop will tell you that that's only happens on TV. But when is the use of deadly force? Again, how do you stop having these confrontations? And before the confrontations happen, how do you walk into those confrontations to make sure we are de-escalating and not escalating the situation? And that's the popular key words going around right now. But think about it. In Atlanta, a man died because he was drunk, right? He took the cop's taser, but they wanted to put him in handcuffs. Was that the right move? That's what he was trained to do, right? And that he was following what the training and the procedures are. And obviously, all across this country, they're being trained the same way. And all across this country, no one is saying, hey, can we take a second look at this? And those are the things that I think that we have shown in Teaneck that you can do to build trust with the community. There's a second piece that you have to have, which is a community policing department. Police and citizenry have to be in a partnership for this to work. You're not just going to get rid of crime in urban and cities all across this country because we're defunding the police or we have social workers. You're still going to have bad actors out there. The question comes down to is, how do you police a city and making sure that you know the bad guys from your regular citizens who are good working people, right? And good people, even if, just in general, what is a threat and what is not a threat to society. The third aspect of this is really coming down to, and Senator Parker alluded to this about having a special prosecutor, but more importantly is like in Teaneck or in Bergen County or all in New Jersey, the Internal Affairs Department is in the actual department. You have your own friends, or you should say your own coworkers investigating you. So imagine if me as the mayor, if somebody accuses me of doing something wrong, and I say to everybody, don't worry, I'm going to investigate myself, all right? And then I come back with the report and say that, okay, the investigation has cleared me. I don't think that would give too much to the public, but that happens time and time again, where the police are policing the police, and there's no checks and balances, there's no separation, and there's no trust with the community that justice is going to be served, right? So this is something that we have to work on. Now, New York and New Jersey are two different kind of very different ways that they're governed. I think the NYPD as an institution is a very hard institution to change. Legislatures have tried it, mayors have tried it, and the citizens really have to take control of what it means to be in policing, not only through laws, but changing at the top. Gutting the police department of people who are not for real reform. And it's going to be a very difficult process, I think, in New York City and cities like Los Angeles. But if you see the chief in Houston, I think that he really has a conciliatory tone and he really wants to put his values in line with his actions of what he's doing. In Minnesota, they're trying to, but the police union is fighting them. The reason I bring that up is in New Jersey, it's very different. In New Jersey, the police chief has the police chief Bill of Rights. We're not even the appointing authority. The person who is in charge of the police department is the Bergen County prosecutor, who is appointed by the governor. And his boss is the attorney general, also appointed by the governor. So local politicians have very, very little control over investigations, over internal affairs investigations, over employee complaints and employee disciplinary matters. Very little control in New Jersey of what a local mayor has in terms of having those reforms. The only thing that we have is the checkbook. And that is usually, if you get to that point, it's a very bad situation to try to use just a checkbook to quote unquote defund the police in a manner that is not necessarily helpful to the situation at all. I think that policing, as well as we need to add mental health component, but not take it away from police and put it into there. You can do both. That's one thing that I always say is that people don't like to hear this, and a lot of people don't. But we're not taxed enough for the things that we want to do, and that's coming from someone who is a fiscal conservative who's had 0% budgets in a row in my tenure as mayor. That all being said, also, what does this mean for Muslims in the social justice movement now? And how do we stand with the African-American community? And I think we who are in the suburbs, and we who are coming from minority communities here and settling in suburbs and have the best schools and have social economic status and who go through college and achieve the American dream, we have to decide if everything that we talked about 1400 years ago and how we were as Muslims, if we put our values in line with our actions. So when we have fundraisers, right, are we also funding and looking at the problems of the Imam Wahideen Sharif's community in Irvington, or the masjids that are in East Orange, or the masjids that are in Newark on Branford Street, right? These are our brothers and sisters, and these are people who go through these problems, but also the economic problems that we can use when we talk about a community center, right? Are we using our pocketbooks to empower communities who don't have the economic power that we have in a Bridgewater, in a Teaneck, New Jersey, in a Wayne, New Jersey, in a Monmouth Junction, New Jersey, in an Edison, New Jersey? These are the things that I think that we have to go out and literally go out, and I encourage everybody to do this, is find a masjid in one of these areas and go in and have Jummah there at least once a quarter, or at least once a month. If you can't do that, at least, look them up and send them a check, because they need they have problems that we can't fathom. Alhamdulillah, that we're so blessed with easy financial successes in our suburban lifestyle, that they have different things that they have to overcome. So I think those are the things that I think as Muslims that we need to do in helping the urban areas. And as American citizens, we need really to look at how we're going to be helping in police reform. And one of the things that we have to really understand is that this is not our movement. And this is something that we need to listen, be allies. And this is something that we need to understand where the African-American community is coming from. And when they say enough is enough, what do they mean when they say enough is enough? When they say, we've had enough, it's because of a history of 400 years of racism in this country. When they're sitting around and they say Black Lives Matter, and somebody else says all lives matter, you have to be able to confront that person and say, yeah, of course, everybody says all lives matter. Who doesn't say all lives matter? But it's the Black lives that are the ones who are being choked out on the street right now. Those are the ones where that the ones that nobody care about. And if they say anything else, I want you to understand, you can go through the NYPD's, from Serpico till now, right? And how many police officers were involved in the drug trade, right? Whether it was crack, whether it was cocaine, whether it was heroin, right? It was, if you watch the movie Serpico, it'll show you that it was institutionalized, right? And what did that mean when you talk about, the breakdown of the families, crime, people who are going into jail, and then their kids are going into jail, and what was brought into the community. We have to be sensitive and talk about history with an honest and open heart to make sure that the people who are in charge and the people who are pulling the purse strings realize that now is enough, and we have to not only address policing, which is that actually can be fixed really easily from policymakers, right? You train police to do something, they do it, right? And you make it against the law for them not to act a certain way, and they do it. Police departments all across this country have been corrupt and they've been cleaned up. The question comes down to is, how do we make sure that everybody gets an equal education? How do we make sure that everybody has equal access to healthcare? How do we make sure that when the people who are working in corporate America and who are using their buying and spending power, that the diversity up the chain of management reflects the people who are buying their products? And these are the things that are going to take a lot of discussion and people with a sincere heart to plan and work for the future for justice. And I'm confident that, Mr. Floyd's death meant something. Obviously, it was for a purpose, and that purpose was to wake up America, and we should all be awake to know what work has to be done in the next decade, so that we can all say honestly that we truly are liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Jazakallah khair, Brother Hameeduddin. Can I ask all the panelists to kind of open up their video and unmute themselves? We've got a series of questions to go through in the next few minutes. Okay, so let me, Senator Parker, let me start with you. Okay, super. So, you know, what you're hearing, I think the community, I do think I hope, inshallah, we're reaching an inflection point in race relations in America. I hope. But whether we are or we not, the question is, what practical advice, Senator Parker, would you give us as a Muslim community to really support the cause, you know, support the African American community, our brothers and sisters there, while at the same time not trying to, I guess, appropriate the feelings and the hurt that's being done. And then if I use the way you described, a little bit of an uncomfortable discussion, but that totem pole of racism. So how can we use, I suppose, our relative privilege to support the African American community? So if you could address those questions, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. Charity starts at home, right? And I think understanding starts at home as well. And as you heard Omar Mohammedi indicate, and as you all know, right, that, you know, there's a lot of African American, and the mayor indicated this as well. There's like I said, 50% of the Muslim population in the United States is African American. So, you know, you don't have to go far, right? Just working and doing more with those African American mosques and Muslim organizations would be a really, really good start. There's nothing that stops Muslim Americans from joining organizations like the NAACP or the Urban League and being being members of those organizations, right? But also building strategic partnerships between mosques and those local organizations, building strategic partnerships between Islamic centers and those organizations to do some, or other organizations. I'm just using the NAACP and the Urban League as examples, but, you know, finding organizations that are doing the work that you connect with and building strategic alliances with them to support the work in whatever way you both find appropriate for you. And I think that's really the easiest way. It's really, it's not hard. And I think it's even easy. Like if I'm in Jersey, right, I'm immediately, Mr. Mayor, connecting with people like Ross Baraka in Newark, right? Who comes, himself out of a tradition of protest and fighting for the causes of African Americans, as did his father, right, who is an icon in the Black community. And so there becomes almost on every level ways that we can connect it on just natural alliances, right? Which people can kind of be in their own formations, right? Don't stay in your silo, but stay in your own formations and build linkages. And really together, those linkages create a chain in which we are then creating, this is the important part, right? We are then in connection because all of this stuff, the white supremacy comes around. And so this week, it might've been the death of an African-American, right? But next week, it may be Islamophobia, right? And then what you do need is then African-Americans sensitive to that, because oftentimes one of the critiques of the African-American community is that we're not sensitive to other people's, oppression, because we feel like it's not as bad as ours, right? And so we didn't pay attention to Islamophobia, right, when they were surveilling Muslims, or, when they were attacking Sikhs because they thought they were Muslims, right? We didn't pay attention to that, right? And I'm saying that, and we didn't pay attention to it even when it affected our own community. And so, but once you start building those connections, it then becomes a two-way street that benefits everyone, because really the common enemy is white supremacy and not just racism against Blacks.
Great, thank you very much for that. I'll have a follow-up question from one of our board members who said he lived 2 blocks away from you back in the day, and now lives in Bridgewater. So he was also talking about how diverse your area.
I think we lost him.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, no, we lost you before. Yes.
Oh, okay, I'm back. Senator Parker, can you hear me?
He's on mute right now.
Okay, Senator Parker, you need to go off mute and then come back on video. Okay, so I have a question from one of your former constituents. I don't know if he's still going to be able to vote for you, but I'll ask the question anyway. You spoke about formation versus silos, and the question was, how do the separate groups who are impacted by racism unite to fight the common cause? Like, what are the first couple of steps to actually make that happen from your perspective?
Yeah. First of all, I think first, what's the saying? First seek to understand, and then seek to be understood, right? And so I think that these conversations right here are the beginning of those conversations, because this is a conversation in which you have people seeking to understand. And I think that's the beginning. I think the next step is then to not just say something, but to do something. And I think it's, you know, how do we have conversations within the context of our own organizations about how we reach out and how do we work with people to take those next important steps, right? And then I think beyond that, right? I think beyond that is then looking at what the need is, right? And so the question in this moment, right, is where do you feel comfortable, right? Where do you feel comfortable being at? Do you want to be involved in a protest? And if you're involved with an organization that's doing protests, their needs are going to be very different than if you're going to, you know, if you run a law firm and you decide that, you know, you want to do some policy work, or you're going to be, you know, helping, you know, support some protesters, right? Or you're going to be working on lobbying activity in your state or your city to see that changes are made, you know, institutionally, right? And so it really, you know, so everybody, you know, I guess everybody according to their abilities, everybody according to their needs, right? Just, you know, it's not, I don't think a plug and chug or everybody should be doing the same thing. People should take an assessment of where they want to be, right? Because we need everything, right? We need people to help protest activities. We need people on the policy front. We need people, you know, who are mayors of cities to change their policies. And sometimes it's just as good as just to be a model. You know, if you happen to be a mayor of a major city in New Jersey, it may be, you know, great this, you know, to be a model of what the possibilities are of what proper policing can be, right? And what it means to have a place where people are respected regardless of who they are, right? And so that I think those are the conversations that need to have.
Great, thank you very much, Brother Omar. A very practical question for you. Since Senator Parker spoke about protests, I know there's a big interest for the Muslim community to attend the protests that we're seeing, even in the COVID-19 situation. So what are our legal rights when we attend a protest? And for example, if a police officer pulls us over, could you perhaps describe that from your perspective, just so that we know our rights when we're attending protests?
It's very clear. You have a right to protest. It's one of the First Amendment rights that is afforded to all Americans. And there's no police officer will prevent you from doing so, as long as you don't do it with violence. So your rights are to protest and not to be afraid. There's intimidation. And if you're exposed to type of violence, you will be a victim, and then you will have redress. And that's really redress. Your civil rights is very important, but don't be scared because of that. Go and protest in a manner that is obviously under the law. You have a right to do it. That is the beauty of America. That's what that should differentiate us from dictatorships, right? We don't have dictatorships here. We have democracy. We have a right to protest. We have a right to express our opinion. Please do so. And your rights, if you are approached by a police officer, please stay calm. Don't try to pick up a fight with a police officer. Try not to do anything. If for some reason you get hit by a police officer, you take care of it later, but don't do anything that can cause you issues.
Great. Okay, thank you, Jazakallah. But Hameeduddin, you spoke a little bit about how at Teaneck you've tried to create a model for local policing. And you also mentioned kind of a 40% minority within the police force, which was really encouraging to hear. How do you though ensure that the managerial supervisory level, that those opportunities are open to people of color, and it's not just the lower level junior officers that make up the minority?
So it's a very good question. So the other thing that we have is a residency requirement here. 90% of my police force has gone through Teaneck High School. So like my police chief, you know, I went to high school with him. My township manager, who is a former police officer, went to high school with us. And I was the first one, William Broughton, to hire our chief executive, came out was a former police officer, but he was the first African-American who took that job. And we also had, I was also able to make the first African-American fire chief also. These things, you have to be, there's no other way to put this. You have to go and do it. Like, it's not, you have to say, okay, look, we want to give everybody a chance. We want to make sure that the diversity, not only in our hiring practice, our chain of command, but also in our vendors, right, reflects the diversity of the town that we have. Our judges, I was a Teaneck High School graduate, Harvard trained, African-American woman, one of 3 women judges in Bergen County. Bergen County is like 92% white. So you have to be deliberate in what you're trying to do. And I think that it doesn't come easy. Not only do you have to, like, if you live in a town, you have to fight for that as a resident, but you have to have people who embody that in terms of the people who you elect to office. So that's, it's not just going to happen, just like anything. Change has enemies, right? And it's going to fight back. When you're talking about police reform, they're going to fight back. Like right now, everything is quiet, but they're going to tell you all the reasons why they can't do something. They're going to tell you all the reasons why, you're taking rid of the sheepdog, and you want to leave the sheep unprotected, and you're blaming the sheepdog for the problems. I've seen all of these different kinds of issues come up. But look, a lot of this is misdirection in the racism, right? Is that policing is just a symptom of the disease, right? The real disease is economic injustice, right? If you have economic opportunities for everybody, especially people of color, if you have economics where everybody has the same healthcare, then who's going to go out and try to get into mischief and try to do things the wrong way to make a living, right? So I think to your question, we have to be deliberate in fight. It's not just enough to be an anti-racist, right? We have to be deliberate in all of these things, right? And go out and say, if we are for justice for all, then we're going to work for it. I mean, Islamic principle, right, is that you can't be a believer unless you believe for your brother what you believe for yourself, right? So we are very, like, our heart breaks when things are happening bad in Syria or in Iraq, in Palestine. Our heart breaks, but it doesn't talk about, my prayers aren't answered if my neighbor is hungry, right? What's the point of getting up for Fajr if my neighbor is hungry, right? And these things that we have to get back to basics as Muslims to figure out how we're going to make sure that so where we are involved in social justice is not, appropriating the cause to talk about our grievances, but helping the African-American community overcome the injustices that they've faced over the last 400 years.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's very helpful. Brother Omar, I have a question for you on the controversial area of qualified immunity, since you discussed that earlier on. And so, some people say that, being a police officer is a really hard role, it's dangerous. So, we do need some form of system to protect police officers. How would you respond to that?
We're not saying that the police officers should not be protected. I think the whole society should be protected. And I think, don't forget, what is the meaning of police officers? Is to protect and serve. That's the slogan that should always be: protect and serve. But if a police officer does not protect and serve, instead kills, then should be liable under the law. And qualified immunity should not be an obstacle for any citizen to have to face the police officer in court. And if this police officer in court is really innocent and has not done anything wrong, then the judge will decide or the jury will decide. But don't prevent the justice system from going forward by stating qualified immunity. And this did not happen before. Qualified immunity was actually instituted only in the 60s. Before was nothing there. And now the qualified immunity actually was instituted only in the forced arrest, and then expanded to other type of conduct by police officer and law enforcement. So even if we decide to leave qualified immunity, We have to be in a narrow, very narrow interpretation and circumstances. Let's not give a blank check to police officers and their qualified immunity.
Okay, great. That's very helpful. Senator Parker, are you still with us?
I am. I would never leave you.
Okay, that's great to hear. Hey, I have a question. Since you spoke about the New York State Legislature, and very recently we've seen kind of states come up with different laws or addressing this topic. How do we elevate this up to the federal level? And what's the role of the federal government in terms of addressing some of these issues from a legislation perspective and Congress specifically?
Yeah, another good question, because when you talk about the issues that like Omar just spoke of qualified immunity, that's really a federal level, right? The state doesn't actually have a ability to kind of deal with the issue of qualified immunity. But there's various things that we can do. And so like you really have to kind of understand what role each level of government has, because there's some things that you could do, again, as you heard Mayor Mohammed talk about. There's some things that mayors could do, right? They can, things around training, things about qualifications. I think a lot of the messaging, that you give as an executive can be done on that local level. The state legislature, I think, is a place where we can provide a maximum amount of transparency, accountability, right? But then also a direction around the issues of things like excessive use of force and practice and policy, right? Around how law enforcement should be engaged, right? Frankly, right, on a technical level, the federal government really doesn't have any real role in policing. Policing really was from a constitutional perspective, was really intended to be taken care of on a state and local level, right? However, what the feds can get involved in anything because they have money, right? And so what they'll do is that, and that's part of what you saw, if you saw the mayor's executive order, or you paid attention to Tim Scott's package that the Republicans are standing behind, they are creating economic incentives for police departments to do various things, right? To change their policies, right? And that's the way that they can be involved. I do think that nationally there is a role around this issue of qualified immunity that they could do, and I think that's probably the biggest thing that they can certainly do. And I also think there are some things around excessive force that could become federal laws, and I think and that would get to the most places easiest. And then thirdly, if we could get the Justice Department, and this wouldn't even require legislation, if you could just get the Justice Department to agree to really prosecute some of these cases that go unprosecuted. I mean, frankly, the U.S. Attorney General in this moment can actually literally act as a special prosecutor in any death of an unarmed civilian by a police officer in the country without legislation, without direction, without anything. You just need a attorney general who's willing to do it. But they could do that in this moment. And that would be the third thing I think that they could do very, very easily. But there is, again, a federal bill that would just that's going to be voted on next week by the Dems in the House. And then we'll see what happens with the Republicans with the Tim Scott package. And hopefully they'll get to something around some of these issues. Unfortunately, they're not talking about qualified immunity. But as you heard Omar talk about, that's in fact one of the things that they really should be drilling down on.
Sure, great. Thanks so much. One final question, Brother Hameeduddin, you spoke about the alliances that we can have. So what do you say? Some people in the Muslim community will say, look, we have our own issues with Islamophobia. So we need to take care of that first before we can help other communities. So what would be your response to that?
I think I wish I had a real, the only thing I can say is we need to learn how to walk and chew gum at the same time. And I think that understanding that, when somebody's civil rights are violated, then, you're next, right? And I think that, again, the concept of justice, the concept of Islam that you talked about in your opening, if we're going to live up to our ideals, our Islamic ideals, then we have to make sure that everybody is taken care of. Enough is enough. I live in I choose to live in Teaneck, New Jersey, right? I grew up here. I have African Americans in my family, alhamdulillah. I choose that my children grow up in a town where their birthday parties are multicultural and diverse, right? New Jersey is one of the most segregated states in America by schools, just like Minnesota, right? And I think we have to be deliberate in our actions as Muslims to see if we're going to have our values be in line with our actions. See, when somebody says like, oh, I can only take care of myself, this again is like a disease in Islam, right? It's like, I'm Moroccan, I'm Hyderabadi, I'm Pakistani, I'm, Palestinian. Like, we are one human race. And that is how God gave us our message. Therefore, we should act. So if the civil rights movements and everything that we came about, why we're here in the 1965 Civil Rights Act, we're here because of the struggles of the civil rights movements of the African American community. If not, I'm sitting somewhere in India and I don't know what my future is. So to all our communities, we have to be deliberate in our actions and realize that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice anywhere, justice everywhere. And we have to put our values in line with our actions. And this is the things that we do. And, we're lucky to have people like Senator Parker, who is, I can't believe it's been this long since we've seen each other. But, during the height of Islamophobia after 9/11, he stood with us. He stood with us when nobody wanted to stand with us, right? He hired our people so that they could go up and to have higher jobs, right? And now when it's his time to stand there, he asks, we need to be there not only shoulder to shoulder, but with our checkbooks so that he can get into higher office and do what we want to say. When Omar Mohammedi was fighting the NYPD, I can't say this enough. There's a joke, however you want to say it, the NYPD is the baddest gang in New York City, okay? Like they get in trouble, 50 of them come, and they're organized and they know how to take care of each other. And again, I'm not saying that all the NYPD is bad, and I'm not that guy who's like wants to jump down. But what I'm saying is that when Omar took on the Diallo case, that takes a lot of courage, right? And if he's sitting there now and he's saying, you know what, guys, I've been talking part of the social justice movement, and this is what we need to do. You at Falah Center are very lucky to have Omar Mohammedi there. He's an asset. Listen to him. Because he is 99% right. He's right 99% of the time. So I think that, look, he's getting mad because he says it's probably 100, but 99%. Omar is right. So we have to be, this is our battle.
Sure.
Just like any other battle, this is our battle.
All right, great. So let me first say thanks to the panel. I think this was a really great discussion. And we should remind ourselves, this is the start of the dialogue, not the end of the dialogue, right? And I think that's really important. And so some very practical tips that I heard from the panel, I wrote down some things for us as a community, as individuals, the opportunity to donate to causes for social justice is there, it's very real. Joining social justice groups and having these formation center, Parker, as you mentioned, these alliances. I think, Hameeduddin, you spoke about how we can reach out to urban masjids who invariably are African American or Latino, who are often struggling for the financial opportunity there, especially when, as you said, Senator Parker, that 50% of the Muslims in the US are African American. So I think these are very real concrete steps and a reminder for all of us, myself included. I also want to leave my community and the panel to think on the fact that, the African American community has made sacrifices in the area of civil rights for us to enjoy the rights that we have today in America. And I don't think we can underestimate the struggle that our African American brothers and sisters made with blood, with their lives. And so it's time for us to step up and pay back. And I think that's really, really important. So again, thank you to the panel for a really wonderful discussion. Really enjoyed it, learned a lot. I'll close out real quickly. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. Jazakallah khair, everyone, for joining. My thanks again to the panel, and we'll see you soon, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.